What if I told you that in the year 897 AD, something so bizarre happened in the Vatican that it would make even the most outrageous modern scandal look tame by comparison? Picture this: a rotting corpse, dressed in papal robes, propped up in a chair inside the most sacred halls of Christianity, facing trial for crimes against the Church. This wasn't some medieval horror story or dark fantasy. This actually happened. And the dead man on trial? Pope Formosus, who'd been mouldering in his tomb for 9 months before being dragged back into the light for one of history's most grotesque legal proceedings. The event became known as the Cadaver Synod, and it represents one of the most shocking episodes in papal history. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. This wasn't just about putting a corpse on trial. This was about power, revenge, and political manipulation so twisted that it would tear apart the very foundations of the Catholic Church for generations to come. You're about to discover how a dead pope became the centerpiece of a trial that was equal parts courtroom drama and horror show, where the accused couldn't speak, couldn't defend himself, and was literally falling apart as the proceedings unfolded. The man orchestrating this macabre spectacle was Pope Stephen VI, and his motivations were so dark and personal that they would ultimately destroy him as well. Before we dive into this nightmare, you need to understand that medieval papal politics weren't just about spiritual matters. They were about controlling the most powerful institution in Europe, commanding armies and wielding influence over kings and emperors. The papacy wasn't just a religious office, it was the ultimate political prize, and men would do absolutely anything to claim it, including putting the dead on trial. The story begins with Pope Formosus, who ascended to the papal throne in 891 AD during one of the most chaotic periods in church history. Rome was essentially a battlefield where different noble families fought for control of the papacy, like it was a crown to be won through violence and treachery. Formosus found himself caught in the middle of this political hurricane, and the decisions he made while alive would come back to haunt him in ways that were literally unimaginable. Formosus wasn't originally supposed to become pope. He had been excommunicated years earlier by Pope John VIII for allegedly conspiring against the papal states and abandoning his diocese. But medieval excommunications were often political weapons rather than genuine spiritual punishments, and when the political winds shifted, Formosus was not only brought back into the church but eventually elevated to its highest office. Here's where the story gets complicated and deeply personal. During his papacy, Formosus made a decision that would seal his fate even beyond death. He crowned Lambert of Spoleto as Holy Roman Emperor, but then, in a move that shocked medieval Europe, he later invited Arnulf of Carinthia to invade Italy and crowned him emperor instead. This wasn't just changing his mind about politics, this was betraying one of the most powerful families in Italy and making enemies who would nurse their grudges long past his natural death. When Formosus died in 896 AD, he probably thought his troubles were over. Medieval people believed that death settled all earthly accounts, that whatever sins or political mistakes you made in life were between you and God once you passed into eternity. But Pope Stephen VI had other ideas. Stephen had been installed as pope, largely through the influence of Lambert of Spoleto's family, the very people that Formosus had betrayed by switching his allegiance to Arnulf. Stephen VI wasn't just angry about Formosus's political manoeuvring. This was personal in a way that goes beyond normal political revenge. Some historians suggest that Stephen genuinely believed Formosus's papal election had been invalid, which would mean that every priest Formosus had ordained, every bishop he had consecrated, and every decision he had made was illegitimate. If that were true, it would create a crisis of legitimacy that could tear apart the entire church hierarchy. But here's the truly disturbing part. Stephen couldn't just declare Formosus's papacy invalid and move on. Medieval canon law required a trial to officially condemn a pope even a dead one. And since Formosus was already dead, Stephen decided to put his corpse on trial. The legal precedent was thin at best. Medieval people occasionally put dead criminals on trial to strip them of property or titles, but putting a dead pope on trial was unprecedented and, frankly, insane. The preparations for this trial were as grotesque as they were elaborate. In January of 897 AD, Stephen VI ordered Formosus's tomb to be opened. The body had been buried for 9 months in the damp conditions beneath St. Peter's Basilica, which meant the corpse was in an advanced state of decomposition. Medieval burial practices weren't designed for long-term preservation, so what they pulled out of that tomb was barely recognisable as having once been human. Palace guards were ordered to exhume the rotting remains and transport them to the papal court. Imagine being the soldier tasked with carrying a 9-month-old corpse through the hallways of the Vatican. The smell alone would have been overwhelming, but this was just the beginning of the horror show that Stephen VI was orchestrating. The corpse was dressed in full papal regalia, the same ceremonial robes that Formosus had worn in life. Picture the scene: rotting flesh barely held together by expensive silk and gold thread, a decomposing skull topped with the papal crown, skeletal hands arranged to hold the symbols of papal authority. This wasn't just disrespectful to the dead, it was a deliberate mockery of everything the papacy was supposed to represent. Stephen VI then had the body propped up in a chair in the papal court like some grotesque puppet waiting for its final performance. The corpse couldn't sit upright on its own. Medieval records suggest that it had to be supported by wooden supports or tied to the chair to keep it from collapsing entirely. Every movement caused pieces of decaying flesh to fall away, filling the courtroom with the stench of death and decay. But Stephen wasn't finished with his macabre preparations. Since the accused couldn't speak for himself, Stephen appointed a deacon to serve as Formosus's defense attorney. This poor man had to stand next to the rotting corpse and attempt to mount some kind of legal defense for a client who was literally falling apart before his eyes. Medieval court records don't tell us what this deacon was thinking, but imagine trying to maintain professional composure while representing a decomposing corpse in the most important trial in Christendom. The charges against Formosus were extensive and carefully crafted to justify what Stephen was doing. He was accused of perjury for allegedly lying during his original papal election, of violating canon law by moving from one bishopric to another, and most importantly, of illegally assuming the papal throne while still under excommunication. Each charge was designed to invalidate not just Formosus's papacy, but every official act he had performed while in office. Stephen VI served as both judge and prosecutor, a clear violation of any reasonable legal procedure, but medieval papal courts operated under different rules than secular justice systems. The Pope was considered to be God's representative on earth, which meant his judgment was theoretically infallible. Stephen used this theological authority to justify what was essentially a show trial designed to produce a predetermined outcome. The trial proceedings were as bizarre as you might expect. Stephen would shout accusations at the silent corpse, demanding answers to questions that obviously couldn't be answered. When the body remained silent, Stephen interpreted this as an admission of guilt. The appointed defense attorney tried to mount some kind of legal argument, but he was fighting an impossible battle against both the evidence and Stephen's predetermined verdict. Medieval chroniclers who witnessed the trial described scenes that sound more like horror fiction than historical fact. The corpse would occasionally shift or move as the wooden supports settled, causing Stephen to react as if Formosus was trying to respond to the charges. Pieces of rotting flesh would fall from the body during particularly animated moments of Stephen's prosecution, creating a gruesome visual backdrop to the legal proceedings. The psychological impact on everyone present must have been enormous. Medieval people were deeply superstitious about disturbing the dead, believing that such actions could bring divine punishment or supernatural revenge. Everyone in that courtroom knew they were participating in something that violated both natural law and Christian teaching, but none of them dared oppose the Pope's will. The trial lasted for several days, with Stephen methodically working through each charge against the decomposing defendant. He presented evidence of Formosus's political betrayals, his alleged canonical violations, and his supposed illegitimate rise to power. The defense attorney made what arguments he could, but the outcome was never in doubt. This was revenge theatre dressed up as legal procedure. Finally, Stephen VI rendered his verdict. Pope Formosus was found guilty on all charges. The consequences of this judgment were as sweeping as they were vindictive. All of Formosus's papal acts were declared invalid. Every priest he had ordained was stripped of their holy orders, and every bishop he had consecrated was declared illegitimate. It was ecclesiastical warfare designed to erase Formosus from church history entirely. But Stephen wasn't satisfied with just invalidating Formosus's papacy. He ordered that the corpse be stripped of its papal vestments, that the 3 fingers used for papal blessings be cut off, and that the body be thrown into the Tiber River, like common refuse. This final act of desecration was meant to demonstrate that Formosus had never truly been Pope at all, that he was just a pretender whose remains deserved no more respect than an executed criminal. The mutilation of the corpse was carried out immediately after the verdict. Palace executioners, probably the same men who would normally carry out death sentences on living criminals, were tasked with removing the blessing fingers from the rotting hands. Medieval records don't describe this process in detail, but given the state of decomposition, it was probably more like breaking apart a piece of ancient leather than actual surgery. The desecrated remains were then loaded onto a cart and transported through the streets of Rome to the Tiber River. This wasn't done secretly under cover of darkness. Stephen VI wanted the public to see what happened to those who opposed his authority, but the real nightmare had only just begun. The trial might have been a grotesque spectacle, but its aftermath would prove even more devastating to the medieval church. Stephen's victory over the dead pope quickly transformed from triumph to catastrophe. The Roman people, initially horrified by the proceedings, began to turn against their living pontiff. They saw the cadaver synod not as righteous justice, but as an act of pure madness that had desecrated the very foundations of papal authority. Within months, Stephen VI found himself facing a massive popular uprising. The same crowds who had witnessed his macabre courtroom drama now demanded his head. They stormed the papal palace, dragged Stephen from his throne, and threw him into the same prison where papal enemies had rotted for centuries. The irony was perfect. The man who had put a corpse on trial was now facing his own very real death sentence. But here's where the story gets truly bizarre. The Romans weren't content with just deposing Stephen. They actually retrieved Formosus's battered remains from the Tiber River, where they had been floating for months like some medieval horror story. The body was reburied with full papal honours, essentially reversing every humiliation Stephen had inflicted. It was as if the dead pope had won the ultimate victory from beyond the grave. Stephen VI was strangled in his cell later that year, probably by agents of the same Roman families whose power games had started this entire nightmare. The cadaver synod had lasted mere hours, but its consequences would haunt the papacy for generations, proving that even in death, medieval politics could be absolutely lethal.